Obioma picked up the clay pot and smashed it against the mud wall. Not in anger, not in rage. Slowly, deliberately, like a man who had already decided something that could not be undone. The pieces scattered across the floor. His children froze. The fire crackled. And from outside the compound, 3 neighbors stopped walking and turned toward the sound. But Adiz did not stop talking. She barely flinched. She kept going, her voice rising, falling, cutting, turning. The way a river keeps flowing even when rocks try to stop it. The words came like they always did. Unstoppable, unaware, endless. And Obioma stood there in the wreckage of that broken pot, staring at the wall, and something inside him, something that had been bending quietly for years, finally snapped without making a sound. He walked out of the compound into the dark night. No lamp, no explanation. Just his back disappearing into the shadows while his wife's voice continued behind him, louder now, insulting the way he walked. The neighbor women exchanged glances at the river the next morning. The elder men shook their heads near the aji tree. And in the market, the whispers had already started, because in the village of Umuaka, nothing stayed secret for long. Something was coming. Everyone felt it. Even the birds seemed quieter that week. Before we dive deeper into the story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click the subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this one come out every week, and you do not want to miss what happens next. Now, let us go back to the beginning, because to understand what Obioma did that night in the forest, you must first understand what brought him there. And to understand that, you must understand Adiz not as a villain, not as a monster, but as a woman who had been shaped by fire long before she ever became one herself. Umuaka was a village of red soil and tall palm trees, where the harmattan came in December carrying dust that settled on eyelashes and rooftops and left everything looking like it was slowly fading away. The people of Umuaka were farmers and storytellers. They woke before sunrise and worked until the sky burned orange. And in the evenings they gathered around fires and spoke about the things that mattered: harvests, marriages, ancestors, the behavior of their neighbors. Because in Umuaka, your behavior belonged to everyone. That was how it worked. And it was into this village that Adiz was born, the 3rd daughter of a woman named Mbik who had survived a terrible marriage with nothing but her voice. Mbik had learned early that silence was surrender. That if you stopped talking, stopped fighting, stopped filling every empty space with noise, the world would crush you completely. She raised her daughters accordingly. Loud, sharp, always ready with a word. Adiz became the sharpest of them all. She was beautiful in the way that made people look twice. High cheekbones, deep brown skin, a full mouth that smiled easily and cut deeply. She was clever. She could calculate market prices in her head faster than anyone in Umuaka. She could read people, their weakness, their dishonesty, their hunger, from the moment they walked toward her stall. She remembered everything, every promise, every slight, every word ever spoken against her or about her. And she never let any of it go. When she married Obioma at 22, the whole village celebrated. Obioma was a quiet, broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and steady hands. The kind of man who fixed things without being asked and listened to elders without checking over his shoulder. He was not wealthy, but he was respected. And in Umuaka, respect was its own kind of currency. In the beginning, their home was a happy one. They farmed together in the early mornings, Obioma clearing the heavy brush while Adiz planted with precision and sang low under her breath. They ate together from the same bowl. They laughed at the same things. On moonlight nights when the whole village gathered to tell stories and dance, Adiz would lean into Obioma's side, and he would rest his hand on her back, and everything between them felt easy. He used to say her voice was his favorite sound. She talked constantly even then, but it was different. Stories, observations, laughter that rolled out of her like water. She had a way of describing things that made ordinary moments feel larger than life. A trip to the market became an adventure. A neighbor's argument became a theater. Obioma would listen and shake his head, half laughing, and think to himself that he had married the most alive person he had ever known. Then the children came. First Chukwamika, then the twins, Ngozi and Kechi. And something shifted, the way things shift in a house when more weight is added to one side. The pressure of feeding 3 children, of keeping the roof repaired, of managing a compound with a leaking back wall and a well that dried up every dry season. All of it pressed down on both of them. But where pressure made Obioma quieter, it made Adiz louder. She began correcting him. Small things at first. The way he spoke to the children. The way he negotiated prices at the market. The way he greeted the landlord. Small corrections, quickly spoken, often in front of others, and Obioma would swallow whatever response rose in his throat and say nothing. He was patient. That was simply who he was. His own father had been the same way, a man who chose silence the way others chose armor. Obioma believed that a home built on peace was worth more than a home built on being right. So he swallowed, and continued swallowing. But Adiz mistook his silence for agreement. The corrections grew louder, more frequent, more public. At the market she would contradict him mid-sentence in front of customers. At family gatherings she would wave away his opinions before he had finished speaking. When neighbors came to the compound she would narrate his failures the way a market crier announces prices. Loudly, repeatedly, without apology. The neighbors began avoiding invitations to their compound. The women at the river started timing their arrivals so they would not overlap with Adiz. And the children, little Chukwamika and the twins, had developed a particular stillness in their eyes that children only develop when they have learned that home is not always safe. Obioma saw all of it. He saw it and he said nothing, until the day of the market incident. It was a Thursday, which was the big market day in Umuaka, when people came from 3 villages away to trade. The market was loud and colorful. Bolts of fabric, dried fish, palm oil in large metal containers, yams stacked in pyramids, children running between adult legs. Obioma had gone to negotiate a deal for a piece of farmland near the eastern ridge. A deal he had been working toward quietly for months. He was speaking with the landowner, an older man named Dimkpa, when Adiz appeared from behind a row of fabric stalls. She had heard from someone, some half-story from a market gossip, that Obioma was negotiating poorly, that he was about to be cheated, and so she arrived the way she always arrived, fast and loud and certain. "What is this man telling you?" she said, pushing herself between Obioma and Dimkpa. "Whatever price he has agreed to, cut it in half. My husband doesn't know how to fight for himself." The market went quiet around them. Dimkpa blinked. Several men nearby turned to look. Obioma stood completely still. A wealthy stranger who had been passing through the market. A trader from the city, well-dressed, with a leather bag under his arm, stopped and watched. He looked at Obioma the way you look at a wound you have seen before. With recognition. With a kind of pity that felt worse than contempt. Adiz kept talking, negotiating over Obioma's head. Explaining what she knew, what he didn't know, why she had to be there, why without her this deal would have collapsed. Dimkpa nodded nervously and eventually left. Deal unclosed. The stranger said nothing. He just looked at Obioma one long moment and then walked away. And Obioma did not shout, did not argue, did not defend himself. He simply looked at the space where Dimkpa had stood. Then he turned and walked back toward the compound. That night he did not eat inside. He carried his food outside to the small wooden bench near the gate and ate alone in the dark, listening to the sounds of Umuaka settling into the night. Distant drums, a woman singing, frogs beginning in the low wet ground near the stream. Adiz came out twice to continue talking. He said nothing. She went back inside. He sat there until the fire inside the compound burned low, and then he walked. Not home. Toward the edge of the village. Toward the small compound behind the old breadfruit tree where a man named Mzina lived alone. Mzina was blind. He had been blind for 20 years. But people in Umuaka said his blindness had only sharpened everything else. His hearing, his sense of a person's spirit, his ability to sit with someone in silence for several minutes and then say the one sentence that split their confusion open like a ripe fruit. He was old. Ancient, the children said, the way children say ancient about anyone over 70. His skin was the color and texture of dried bark, and he wore the same faded cloth every day and kept a small fire burning outside his door every evening without explanation. He was already sitting outside when Obioma arrived. As if waiting. "Obioma," he said, without turning his head. "Sit." Obioma sat. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled between them. Somewhere in the dark, a nightjar called. Then Mzina said, "How long?" Obioma understood the question without needing it completed. 7 years, he said. "It has been getting worse for 3. Mzina was quiet. Then, "A drum that never stops beating will eventually tear its own skin." Obioma stared into the fire. "I have tried silence. I have tried argument. I have tried pleading. Nothing changes. Did you try letting her hear herself?" Obioma frowned. "What does that mean?" Mzina smiled. "Just slightly. Come back tomorrow night. And bring your patience. Because what I will tell you cannot be hurried." Obioma came back. The next night. And the night after. For 6 nights he sat beside Mzina's fire and listened. And slowly, piece by piece, an idea began to form. Strange and uncomfortable and unlike anything Obioma had imagined. Adiz noticed the nightly disappearances. She noticed because Adiz noticed everything. She followed him on the 4th night, staying far back in the shadows, her wrapper pulled tight around her shoulders. She watched her husband sit with the old blind man and she strained to hear the words, but the fire and the distance between them swallowed most of it. She heard only one sentence, clearly, for words spoken in the old man's cracked, certain voice. "Let the mouth hear itself." She stood in the dark for a long moment after that, and something about those words, the quietness of them, the way they landed, made her stomach tighten in a way she could not name and would not admit. She went home and that night she talked louder than usual, filling the compound with words until the children fell asleep with their hands over their ears. If you are still watching up to now, type "I am still here" in the comment section. It means more than you know. Also subscribe to this channel if you've not done so yet. Your subscription goes a long way. Now, the invitation came on a Sunday. Obioma appeared in the doorway of the cooking area where Adiz was grinding pepper, and he looked at her differently. Not with the tired resignation she had grown used to seeing in his face. Not with the silent suffering she had learned to ignore. He looked at her the way he had looked at her when they were young, direct, steady, like a man who had made a decision. He said, "There is a gathering in the forest next Friday, an ancestral remembrance. I want you to come with me." Adiz looked up from her grinding. "Me? You? My wife?" He paused. "It has been a long time since we went anywhere together." She opened her mouth to say something, to question, to probe, to find the angle. But something about the stillness in his expression stopped her. She looked at him for a long moment. "Fine," she said. And then, because she was Adiz, she spent the next 4 days telling everyone who would listen that her husband had finally started acting like a man again. Friday came wet and warm, clouds low and gray over the village. They set out after the evening meal, Obioma carrying a small lamp, Adiz wrapping a thick cloth around her shoulders against the forest cold. The children were left with a neighbor. The compound behind them grew quiet as they walked. The path into the forest was narrow and old, roots crossing it like fingers, leaves dripping from the afternoon rain. Adiz talked for the first 20 minutes, about the neighbor who had looked at her strangely, about a debt someone in the village owed her, about the price of tomatoes at the market, about Chukwamika's behavior at school. Obioma walked ahead and said almost nothing. The forest deepened. The lamp made a small circle of yellow light around them, and outside that circle everything was dark and alive with sounds. Insects, something moving in the undergrowth, the distant knock of a woodpecker still working in the dark. Adiz's talking slowed, not because she chose silence, but because the forest had its own voice, and it was louder here than she expected, and the words coming out of her began to sound different even to herself, thin, almost nervous, like someone tapping on a wall to hear if anything is hollow behind it. "How far?" she asked. "Not far." They walked another 20 minutes. Then the trees opened. into a clearing ringed by ancient Irako trees whose roots rose out of the ground like the ribs of some enormous sleeping creature. In the center of the clearing stood a small structure, for wooden posts and a roof of old thatch, which might have been a shrine or a storage hut or simply something the forest had assembled on its own over many years. Torches burned at each corner. Their light moved in the slight breeze. Mzina sat in the center of the structure on a low stool, wrapped in white cloth, his unseeing eyes directed at a point just above the treeline. Around the clearing, at a distance, stood several people from the village. Obioma had spoken to them separately, quietly, over the previous weeks. They stood in the shadows, still watching. Adiz stopped walking. "What is this?" "Come," Obioma said gently. "This is not a gathering. What is happening here?" "Adiz." He turned to her. His voice was quiet, the quietest it had ever been, and it did something to her chest she could not explain. "Trust me, just this once." "Come." She looked at the people in the shadows. She recognized some of them, women from the river, men from the Aji tree meetings, two of her own cousins. Their faces were unreadable. She walked forward. Mzi Na spoke without preamble. "Sit," he said, "and listen. This place was built by your ancestors for one purpose, so that a person could hear the true weight of their own words, not as they are spoken, but as they are received." Adiz sat across from him on a low bench. Obioma sat beside her. "I don't understand," she said. "You will." What happened next? Adiz would spend the rest of her life trying to properly explain to her children. It began with a voice. One of the women standing in the shadows spoke a sentence. A single sentence. And Adiz recognized it immediately as her own words. Something she had said at the river 2 months ago, mocking a neighbor whose husband had lost his job. She had said it without thinking. A quick cutting remark that had made 2 women laugh. Then another voice, a man this time, repeating something Adiz had said publicly about Obioma's negotiating word for word, in her own cadence, her own sharp rhythm. Then another, and another. Obioma had spent 3 weeks quietly asking people in the village if they remembered the exact words Adiz had spoken to them or about them. He had carried a small notebook, a thing people had teased him for, and written them down. And then, with Mzi Na's instruction, he had organized them into a sequence, an order that would build the way a storm builds. The voices came slowly at first. Her insult to the landlord's wife 3 years ago, her dismissal of her mother-in-law at a funeral, her public humiliation of Obioma at the Eastern Ridge negotiation, the thing she had said to her daughter Ngozi when the girl had brought home a poor grade, words that had made the child hide in the corner of the room and cry silently for an hour. Adiz's hands had been in her lap. Now they gripped the edge of the bench. The voices kept coming. They were not distorted. They were not supernatural. They were simply the voices of people she knew. Neighbors, cousins, market women, repeating with total accuracy the things she had said, the way she had said them, sometimes with the laugh that followed, sometimes with the silence that followed, and hearing them outside of herself, stripped of the context in her own head that always made them seem justified, stripped of the intention she always assigned to them. She heard them the way other people heard them. Mean, careless, relentless. The voice of her own daughter came from the shadows then. Ngozi, 12 years old and small for her age, standing at the edge of the torchlight with Obioma's quiet eyes and her mother's sharp cheekbones. And she recited, without emotion, without accusation, simply clearly and truthfully, 3 things her mother had said to her in the last year alone. Adiz's throat closed. She was on her feet without knowing she had stood up. "Stop," she said. "Stop." The clearing went quiet. Mzina waited. Adiz stood in the middle of the torchlit clearing and looked around at the faces she had known all her life. She looked at her daughter. She looked at her husband. And something in her, something she had been holding up with noise and volume and relentless forward motion for as long as she could remember, simply gave way. She sat back down. She did not cry immediately. Adiz was not built for easy tears. But her hands were shaking and her breathing had become the shallow, rapid kind that comes before a storm. and the shaking traveled up her arms and into her chest and settled there like something finally finding its shape. Obioma spoke, for the first time that night, in a voice so low she had to lean toward him to hear it. "At ease," he said. "I never wanted a silent wife. I never wanted a woman who agreed with everything I said or never argued or never pushed back. That is not what I married you for. I married you because you were alive in a way I had never seen. Because your voice could fill a room and make everything brighter." He stopped, swallowed. But somewhere along the way, the talking stopped being about us. It became about winning, about making sure no one could ever reduce you. And I understand why. I know what your mother lived through. I know what you watched her survive. But Adiz. His voice broke almost imperceptibly before steadying. "Our children are learning to be afraid of coming home." The silence after those words was the kind that weighs something. Adiz's eyes had filled. She was looking at Obioma's hands. He said, "I only wanted peace, not silence. Peace." Mzina spoke then. His voice was like dry leaves in a slow wind. "There is no magic here tonight," he said. "There is no curse. No ancestral punishment. Only truth. The hardest thing in the world to carry is a true reflection of yourself. Most people run from it their whole lives. The question tonight is whether you are brave enough to hold it." Adiz's voice, when it finally came, was so different from its usual self that it startled the people listening. Small, stripped of its performance. "I thought," she said slowly, "that being quiet meant I was disappearing." No one answered her. She looked at her daughter standing in the torchlight. "I thought if I stopped pushing, stopped talking, stopped insisting, that I would just..." She stopped. "That I would become nothing." Mzina said, "And what do you think now?" She was quiet for a long time. "I think," she said finally, "that I became nothing anyway, but differently than I feared." Ngozi crossed the clearing and sat beside her mother without being asked. Adiz put her arm around her daughter and held her tightly, the way she had not done in a very long time, and the shaking in her chest moved into her face and then, quietly, without theatrics, without performance, she cried. Obioma reached over and took her hand. The torches moved in the breeze. The people in the shadows began, one by one, to walk back toward the village. They walked home differently. Adiz did not speak for most of the return journey, and Obioma did not try to fill the silence, and that was new. That particular quality of quiet between two people who have said the thing that needed saying and are now simply walking beside each other in the aftermath. Near the edge of the forest, before the trees gave way to the path that led back to the village compounds, Adiz stopped walking. "How long did it take you to plan that?" she asked. Obioma considered. 6 weeks. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You went to all that trouble instead of just shouting at me?" "I have never shouted at you." "I know." Her voice was quiet. "I know you haven't." She paused. "That's one of the things I used to think was weakness. And now," she looked at him in the dark for a long moment, "now I think you are the strongest person I have ever known." They stood there at the edge of the forest for a little while longer. Then they walked home. What followed was not a sudden transformation. That is not how real life works, and it is not how this story works either. Adiz did not wake up the next morning silent and perfectly gentle. There were days she slipped back into old patterns. The quick cutting remark, the public correction, the voice rising before the mind could catch it. And on those days she would stop herself, sometimes mid-sentence, and the look on her face in those moments, the brief flash of awareness, of recognition, was something Obioma had never seen on her before. Awareness. That was the change. Not silence. Awareness. She began doing something she had not done since the early years of the marriage. She began asking Obioma questions and then waiting for the actual answer. Not the pause before her next point, but genuine waiting. Genuine curiosity about what he thought. She apologized to Ngozi on a Sunday morning. Privately, in the cooking area while the others were still sleeping. She sat the girl down and said, without preamble, "Some of the things I have said to you were not fair. I want you to know that I am aware of that now." Ngozi looked at her mother with the wary, careful eyes of a child who has been hurt before and is not yet sure whether it is safe to believe in something new. But she nodded, and she let her mother hold her. The village noticed. Slowly and then unmistakably the village noticed. The women at the river began arriving at the same time as Adiz again. Small conversations started. Cautious, testing. And Adiz did something new. She listened more than she spoke. She asked about children, about harvests, about worries. And she kept the things people told her to herself, which was something they had never trusted her to do before. Men stopped laughing at Obioma when his name came up. And Obioma, who had been carrying a particular weight in his shoulders for 3 years, began to seem lighter, more present. He started finishing sentences at the Aji tree gatherings without bracing for interruption. He started sleeping through the night. Their compound changed. The children felt it first, the way children always feel changes in a home before adults name them. Chukwuemeka began bringing friends home after school. The twins started laughing more loudly, which is one of the truest signs that a home has become safe, when children use their full voices without checking first. At a moonlight gathering some weeks later, Mzina sat at the center of the circle the way he always did when there was a story worth telling. And he spoke not about Obioma and Adiz. He was too wise for that, but about water. Water, he said, does not announce itself before it enters the ground. It does not shout as it moves through roots. It does not demand credit for the tree that grows above it. But nothing grows without it. The people of Umuaka listened in the way they always listened to Mzina, with their full attention, even the children. A home, he continued, can survive poverty, can survive drought. It has survived hunger and sickness and death. But it cannot survive being slowly cut open every day by the person inside it who is supposed to hold it together. He paused. The mouth is a powerful thing. Use it to build. Because once a word leaves you, you can apologize for it, but you cannot unspeak it. It has already entered the place it entered. And only time and great patience decides whether it can be forgiven. The fire crackled. Someone's baby made a sound and was quickly comforted. Then the gathering went on the way village gatherings always did. Stories, soft laughter. The gentle noise of people who know each other well enough to sit together comfortably in the almost dark. And near the back of the circle, Obioma and Adiz sat beside each other, not performing for anyone, not demonstrating their healing as though it were something to exhibit, just sitting, her shoulder against his arm, his hand near hers on the mat. The moon came out from behind a cloud and spread its light across the compound and across the rooftops of Umuaka and across the red soil paths that connected all the compounds to each other the way all things are connected, by what passes through them, by what is carried and put down, by the choices made in the middle of the night when no one is watching. If this story touched something in you today, if it made you think about the words you carry, the ones you have said and the ones you wish you could take back, then let us know. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this one. We are here every week with folktales from across Africa. Stories with wisdom buried in them. Stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Because that is the thing about stories told around fires. They do not end when the fire dies. They travel, from mouth to ear to heart to memory. And sometimes, if the story is the right one at the right moment, they change something. Even in you, even now.